She was the woman who tore corsets out of history and gave women back their breath. With needle and thread, she transformed oppression into freedom, discomfort into elegance, silence into a roar that echoed across generations. Coco Chanel did not simply design dresses. She designed a new destiny. Every stitch was a challenge, every perfume a revolution. But while the world crowned her the queen of fashion, another story was being woven in the shadows. In the salons of the Ritz, between champagne glasses and forbidden whispers, her name appeared alongside Nazi officers, her life entangled in a game of espionage and power no one could have imagined. The heroine who liberated women became a suspect. The goddess of style faced the indelible stain of betrayal. Coco Chanel was both orphan and empress, visionary and fugitive, myth and shadow. A woman who learned from childhood that poverty could be disguised with dignity, that loneliness could be turned into a weapon, and that fashion was not just fabric, but the most silent and lethal way of conquering the world. Her name, engraved in pearls and tweed, remains an eternal emblem. But behind the glitter beats a question that divides history. Was she an angel who gave wings to women, or a shadow who struck a pact with darkness? Gabrielle Bonjour Chanel was born in 1,883 inches Saumur, a small town in France, and from her very first breath life denied her the luxury she would one day command. Her mother, worn down by misery, died when Coco was only 12 years old. Her father, unable to carry the burden of 5 children, abandoned her without looking back. What remained was not a home, but the cold walls of a convent in Aubazine, where the nuns in black and white became her first silhouettes, and the tolling of the bells was the music of her shattered childhood. Inside that orphanage, while other girls accepted the destiny of obedience, Coco watched with hunger and fury. Thread and needle were the only tools given to her, and with them she began mending not only fabric but her torn pride. There she discovered that sewing was no pastime, it was a weapon. Every stitch reminded her that she depended on no one, that her father's abandonment and the world's indifference could be transformed into discipline, into ambition, into defiance. The convent taught her austerity, straight lines, the beauty of simplicity. The stained glass, the gray stone, the almost militaristic sobriety of the habits etched themselves into her memory like a secret code. Years later, when her designs conquered Paris, that austere childhood would resurface in dresses of clean lines and absolute colors. White, black, beige. Her entire style was born from that youth stripped of adornment, a void that could only be filled with ingenuity. But beyond aesthetics, it was her character that was forged. Gabrielle learned not to beg, not to plead, not to expect compassion. She learned to disguise herself, to stand tall as if poverty were invisible, to smile while hunger burned inside her. That ability to reinvent herself, to turn vulnerability into a mask, became the seed of Coco Chanel, the woman who would one day persuade the world that elegance could rise, even from ashes. When she left the convent, she was not a rescued child, she was a hardened soul. She had seen human fragility up close and swore never again to depend on anyone. With a needle in her hand and a fierce determination in her eyes, she began walking toward a destiny that still seemed impossible. Paris did not yet know her name. The world had no suspicion of her arrival. But deep inside that abandoned orphan, the flame was already burning, the one that would soon set the history of fashion ablaze. When Gabrielle left the convent, the world was not waiting with open arms. She survived as a seamstress in small workshops and sang at night in smoky cafes, where men began calling her Coco, a nickname born from a song she repeated again and again to distract herself from sorrow. That stage of smoke and fleeting applause did not promise glory, but it gave her what she needed most: connections, half-open doors toward a destiny she was determined to force open. It was in that atmosphere that she met Etienne Balsan, a wealthy young man who introduced her to the heights of French society. Among horses, parties, and capricious lovers, Coco discovered that luxury could be a disguise, but also a battlefield. She observed the aristocratic women, trapped in corsets that suffocated both their bodies and their spirits, dressed as if they were ornamental statues built for the male gaze. In that spectacle of lace and cages of fabric, Coco felt the same fury she had once felt in the convent. Women were chained, only now their chains glittered. There, she made the decision that would forever define her name, to cut those chains apart with needle and scissors. She began creating simple hats, stripped of extravagant feathers and absurd adornments, transforming them into objects of desire. Women felt different in them, freer, more modern, as if the weight of centuries of submission had suddenly been lifted from their heads. Her boutique in Deauville, opened with the support of Arthur Boy Capel, became the epicenter of a quiet revolution. Coco was not offering fashion, she was offering liberation. She shortened dresses until they flowed, removed unnecessary layers, and allowed the fabric to breathe alongside the body. Her designs were a scandal in a Paris addicted to excess, but precisely for that reason they became irresistible. Every woman who dared to wear Chanel was not merely buying clothes, she was claiming power. In just a few years, the orphan without a respectable surname had transformed into a threat to the old guard of fashion. Coco Chanel did not ask for permission. She shattered conventions. Her minimalist style was not a lack of imagination, but a declaration of war against everything that oppressed women. And Paris, the capital of luxury, began to whisper a name that would soon rise into a roar: Chanel. In 1921, Coco Chanel made a decision that seemed like a whim, but in truth was a masterstroke against time itself. She created a perfume. In a world where women's fragrances were split between innocent floral notes and heavy essences meant to mask the scent of bodies trapped in corsets, Chanel sought something else. She wanted a fragrance as complex as the modern woman, elegant, free, untamable. For this mission, she chose Ernest Beau, a perfumer who had once worked in the court of the Tsars. He presented her with a series of numbered samples, and among them was number 5. Coco did not hesitate. Destiny had a number, and that number was hers. She embraced it not by chance. 5 had always been her lucky charm, the same number the nuns at Aubazine would repeat as the girls crossed the cloister in line. The past was weaving into the future, and the fragrance became ritual. Chanel number 5 smelled like nothing the world had known. It wasn't a single flower, but an accord, a symphony built with jasmine, May rose, sandalwood, aldehydes that added a shimmering, metallic, almost futuristic edge. It was clean yet sensual, cold yet burning, pure yet mysterious. A perfume that didn't just describe a woman, it invented her. Every drop was a mask, a shield, a promise. When Chanel released it, she shattered every marketing rule of her time. She did not choose an ornate bottle, but a geometric vessel. Austere, almost medicinal, with a stopper echoing the architectural cuts of Place Vendôme. No excess, only purity. As if the fragrance were a secret sealed in glass. Minimalism became luxury. The impact was immediate. Parisian elites, used to predictable perfumes, became addicted to this scent that defied definition. Chanel number 5 was not just worn on the skin, it lingered in memory. It was the scent of modernity, of a woman who no longer asked for permission to exist. And then came the ultimate stroke of genius, Marilyn Monroe. When asked in an interview what she wore to bed, she answered with a smile, "Just a few drops of Chanel number 5. That phrase, breathed like a sigh, transformed the perfume into legend. It was no longer merely a bottle, it became Hollywood fantasy. The sensuality of bare skin, immortality captured in glass. But behind the magic lay ambition. Coco Chanel, shrewd as a strategist, wanted not just a product, but an empire. She signed an agreement with the Wertheimer brothers to mass produce the fragrance. At first it seemed advantageous, But in time, she realized she had surrendered far more than she imagined. They controlled most of the profits. Obsessed with regaining power over No. 5, Coco waged legal and personal battles that would last decades. This conflict revealed something deeper. Chanel could not bear the thought of losing control over her creation. No, 5 was not just perfume, it was her distilled soul, proof that austerity, abandonment, and hunger could be transformed into liquid gold. Each bottle was a fragment of her life, embalmed forever. Over time, Chanel No. 5 became a universal myth. It was the fragrance that accompanied wars and reconciliations, secret lovers, and film stars. It was the scent that defined the 20th century, and still today, every 30 seconds, another bottle is sold somewhere in the world. A perfume that defied time itself, as if every drop were a pact with eternity. Coco Chanel had conquered fashion with fabric, but with No. 5 she captured something even more powerful. Memory, skin, desire. Her name no longer dressed only bodies. It now enveloped souls, and with that austere crystal bottle, Gabrielle the orphan from Saumur became an immortal myth. In 1926, Vogue published an image that seemed almost innocent, almost minimalist. A simple black dress, stripped of excess adornment, designed by Coco Chanel. The caption declared it, "The uniform of the future for all women of good taste." Few could have imagined that this garment, soon nicknamed the Little Black Dress, would become one of the most powerful weapons in the history of fashion. Until then, black had been the color of mourning, a reminder of death and austerity. It was the shade of nuns, of funerals, of solemn restraint. Chanel tore it from the shadows and redefined it as a symbol of sophistication. With a single gesture, she stripped black of its sorrow and transformed it into a manifesto of independence. A woman dressed in black was no longer in mourning, she was conquering the world. The dress was not a mere aesthetic whim, it was a political statement. At a time when women's wardrobes were weighed down with lace, embroidery, and corsets disguised as luxury, Chanel dared to embrace radical simplicity. Her design embraced the silhouette without suffocating it, allowed the body to breathe, to move, to work, to live. It was the perfect union of comfort and authority. The impact was immediate. Silent film actresses and nightlife stars adopted the little black dress as the uniform of modernity. The streets of Paris filled with women who, by wearing it, seemed to shed centuries of submission. The dress became a mirror, reflecting a new femininity that did not apologize, that did not fear sobriety, that dared to be direct, even dangerous. World wars and economic crises only amplified its power. In times of scarcity, black offered sobriety and resilience. In clandestine parties and smoky jazz clubs, the little black dress shone brighter than any jewel. It became a secret code among women who demanded to be seen not as decorative dolls, but as protagonists of their own stories. Decades later, the dress would achieve immortality on the silver screen. Audrey Hepburn, with her fragile frame and luminous gaze, wore it in Breakfast at Tiffany's. That single image, a woman alone, breakfasting before a glittering jewelry window, elevated the little black dress into global legend. It was no longer just fashion, it was a cultural symbol. But behind that triumph lay a deeper truth. Coco Chanel had understood what no one before her had. Fashion did not need to scream, it needed to whisper with power. Black, in its apparent silence, spoke louder than 1,000 colors. It carried mystery, authority, sensuality. It was an emptiness, loaded with meaning, as if every woman who wore it claimed ownership of her own destiny. The little black dress broke the final barrier, that of social class. In it, a wealthy woman and a humble woman could share the same silhouette, the same power. Chanel had conceived it as a democratic uniform, a garment that united and liberated. Never before had a single dress wielded such force as an instrument of equality. With the creation of the little black dress, Coco Chanel did not simply change women's wardrobes, she changed the way the world looked at women. She transformed the color of mourning into the banner of a new era, and in doing so, she elevated fashion to the rank of a silent revolution. When the air raid sirens began to rattle Paris in 1940, the city that had once been the capital of luxury and frivolity was transformed into a dark chessboard. The cabaret lights went out, shop windows were draped in heavy curtains, and the echo of German military boots thundered along the boulevards. Amidst that silence, broken only by rifles and marching steps, one figure still walked with her head held high: Coco Chanel. For many, the occupation meant hunger and fear. For Chanel, it meant opportunity and risk. The designer who had built an empire on her name was not ready to lose her power. Her base of operations, the Hotel Ritz, became both a sanctuary and a prison. Within its velvet walls and corridors patrolled by Nazi officers, Coco lived one of the most contradictory chapters of her life. It was there that she began a relationship with Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a German officer who worked as a spy. He offered her protection, access, and comfort. She offered him glamour, influence, and a surprising link to French high society. Together, they dined lavishly, while, across the city, thousands of Parisians stood in endless lines for bread. The woman who had once freed women with simple dresses now shared champagne with the men who chained Europe. Rumors soon spread. Chanel was accused of working as an intelligence agent for the Germans under the codename Westminster in honor of her former lover, the Duke of Westminster. According to declassified documents released years later, she participated in an operation called Model, which aimed to broker a peace pact between Germany and Britain. She was not simply a designer trying to survive, she had become a pawn in a geopolitical chess game. But the war offered her more than lovers and secrets. It also gave her the chance for revenge. For years, Coco had been locked in a bitter conflict with the Wertheimer brothers, who controlled the majority of the profits from Chanel No. 5. During the occupation, she attempted to exploit anti-Semitic laws that stripped Jews of their businesses, hoping to regain full control of her most famous creation. That maneuver, cold and calculated, revealed the Chanel willing to stop at nothing to reclaim what she believed was hers. The end of the war was brutal for her reputation. As Paris celebrated liberation and women accused of collaborating with the Nazis were paraded through the streets, shorn, beaten, branded with shame, Coco Chanel was arrested and interrogated. The shadow of betrayal loomed over her. Yet unlike so many others, she never faced a tribunal or prison. She was released quickly. Why? Many pointed to the intervention of Winston Churchill, her old friend and protector, who is believed to have pulled strings to spare her a humiliating fate. The price of that salvation was moral exile. In 1945, Chanel left Paris and retreated to Switzerland. There she spent nearly a decade, surrounded by silence, wealth, and suspicion. She was a queen without a throne, a goddess fallen from grace. The world of fashion moved on without her, and many assumed her story had ended. Yet the ghosts of her past never faded. Decades later, declassified documents confirmed that Coco Chanel had indeed worked with the Nazis, though the extent of her collaboration remains debated. To some, she was a pragmatic opportunist who did what was necessary to survive impossible times. To others, she was a traitor who stained the white dress of her legacy with an indelible shadow. What is certain is that World War II exposed the darkest side of Coco Chanel, a brilliant and ambitious woman capable of reinventing fashion, yet willing to make deals with the enemy and profit from the suffering of others. Her life, which until then had been told as a story of liberation, became a moral labyrinth. From the occupied streets of Paris to the gilded salons of the Ritz, Coco Chanel experienced the war like few others. She was neither victim nor heroine. She was a protagonist in an ambiguous chapter filled with secrets and shadows. And in that brutal contrast between the black dress that liberated women and the Nazi uniforms that surrounded her, the eternal paradox of her name was born. Was Coco Chanel the angel who gave wings to women, or the shadow who struck a pact with darkness? World War II never allowed that question to have a clear answer, and perhaps it is precisely that ambiguity that keeps the fascination with her alive. The certainty that even the most glorious myths hide cracks that can never be erased. In 1954, when Coco Chanel returned to Paris, the city had changed as much as she had. The ruins of war still lingered in the streets. But in fashion, a new empire reigned. Christian Dior and his new look, his voluminous gowns, sweeping skirts, and cinched waists pushed women back into the silhouette that Coco had banished 3 decades earlier. The world seemed to have forgotten the woman who had once freed millions with straight lines and dresses that breathed liberty. She was 71, had spent nearly a decade in Swiss exile, and her name was tainted with whispers of Nazi collaboration. Many believed she was finished, but Coco did not know the meaning of surrender. From her childhood in the convent, she had learned that the only way to survive was to rise from ashes. Now, faced with the aesthetic dictatorship of the new look, she felt it was time to strike again. On the 5th of February 1954, Chanel presented her new collection at Rue Cambon, in the same house that had once been her fortress in the golden years. Journalists and critics welcomed her with skepticism, even mockery. An old woman trying to revive past glories, they murmured. But when the models began to walk, Paris held its breath. What appeared were not princesses in impossible skirts, but modern women, tweed suits, straight jackets, comfortable skirts, practical pockets, sober lines. Chanel was not offering a costume. She was offering a uniform for the new working woman of the post-war era. A woman who no longer wanted to resemble a doll, but to stride with authority through offices, cafes, streets, and salons. The French press was merciless. A total failure, some papers declared. They said her style was dead, a relic of another time. But abroad, in the United States and Great Britain, the story was different. There, women entering the workforce found in Chanel the perfect ally. Her new vision was not nostalgia, it was a practical revolution. What became known as Chanel's second life had begun. Her return was not only aesthetic, but personal. Coco reclaimed her suite at the Hotel Ritz, as if the ghosts of the war had never forced her out. She surrounded herself once more with pearls, cigarettes, and meticulous routines. But beneath that facade of control burned an urgency. To prove that, despite her age and her tainted past, she could still dictate the future of global fashion. And she did. Within a few years, the tweed suit had become an emblem. Jackie Kennedy wore it in the White House, and the world saw it stained with blood the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. That tragic moment turned Chanel's design into a symbol of history, power, and female vulnerability. The quilted handbag with the golden chain that 2.55 was born in the same era, destined to eternal desire. Every piece was a reminder that Coco had not returned to be a shadow of the past, but to rule once more. Against all odds, the woman once accused of treachery reclaimed her place as an empress of fashion. It was as if her life, always shaped by contradictions, had reinvented itself yet again. The world had changed, but Coco Chanel imposed her rules once more. At 70, she defeated the critics, resurrected an empire, and transformed women's wardrobes again. Her comeback was not merely a triumph of style, it was an act of vengeance against all who had declared her dead. The woman once accused of striking a pact with darkness returned dressed in pale tweed, pearls gleaming at her throat, carrying a fierce certainty. Nothing could destroy Chanel. Not poverty, not abandonment, not war, not scandal. Her style, like her name, was destined to endure. Coco Chanel's return was not merely a comeback to the runways. It was the rebirth of an empire without borders. In the era of 1950 and the dawn of 1960, While the world rebuilt itself from devastation, Chanel transformed her name into something beyond fashion, a universal symbol of power, luxury, and modernity. Her house on Rue Cambon beat once again like a heart in the center of Paris. There, in the famous mirrored salon where she observed every show from the staircase, pieces were created that transcended seasons. The tweed suit, with its straight jackets and gilded buttons, became the uniform of the political and cultural elite. Hollywood actresses, first ladies, and European aristocrats wore Chanel not merely as clients, but as ambassadors of a new way of life. But Coco did not settle for dressing bodies. She wanted to permeate the air, adorn hands, inhabit the most intimate desires. She revived perfume production, strengthened the global reach of Chanel No. 5, and launched new fragrances that secured the Maison's dominance in cosmetics. Each bottle was a reminder that luxury could be captured, transported, and carried into distant lands. Jewelry and accessories became another field of conquest. Her pearl necklaces, once reserved for aristocracy, turned into everyday emblems of modern femininity. The quilted 2.55 bag, with its golden chain strap, became an object of cult devotion, practical, elegant, eternal. It was not a mere accessory, it was a portable manifesto of independence. What set Chanel apart from her contemporaries was her ability to construct an entire universe. While others offered fleeting collections, she offered a lifestyle. To be a Chanel woman meant to inhabit an idea, independence, restraint, mystery. It was not only the garment, it was the attitude, the silhouette, the way one lit a cigarette and faced the world with a blend of defiance and elegance. The global expansion was unstoppable. In New York, London, and Tokyo, Chanel became synonymous with status. Magazines celebrated her, celebrities sought her, and critics who had once predicted her downfall now recognized her as the empress who had survived everything. Her fashion was ageless, borderless. It could dress a rebellious teenager in Manhattan or a mature aristocrat in Rome, and in both, the woman felt part of a secret sisterhood. Yet behind the brilliance of expansion hid a solitary woman. Coco never married, never formed a family, and spent her nights in her Ritz suite, surrounded by mirrors and silence. While her name conquered the planet, her private life dissolved into lonely routines. Perhaps solitude was the price of greatness. The Chanel empire was not just an economic triumph, it was a cultural victory. She redefined how the world understood luxury. No longer excess or ostentation, but sobriety, permanence, discipline. She turned fashion into a silent religion, where black, white, and beige were sacred laws, and style became a creed destined to outlive its creator. By the time Chanel reached this pinnacle, her name no longer belonged to a woman of flesh and blood, but to a global myth. The orphan of Aubusine had become the architect of an eternal empire, and though the shadows of war still pursued her, the brilliance of her legacy eclipsed them in collective memory. Chanel was no longer just Coco. Chanel was a universal language, one that spoke of power and elegance in every corner of the world. Coco Chanel built a myth of freedom. Every dress she created seemed to proclaim that women were no longer chained, that they could walk without corsets, without heavy adornments, without apologizing for taking up space. Her designs spoke of independence, but in her personal life, freedom carried a different taste, that of solitude. From her youth, Chanel surrounded herself with powerful lovers, aristocrats, dukes, artists, military men. Arthur Boyd Capel, the great love of her life, was the one who financed her first boutique and showed her a horizon beyond poverty. When Capel died in a car accident in 1919, Coco was devastated. She never gave herself to anyone with the same passion again. That loss became a wound that never healed, a ghost that followed her into every hotel room, every glass of champagne. Her later romances were marked by convenience relationships that offered connections and security, but never the fulfillment of that first love. Even her most publicized affairs with the Duke of Westminster or the German officer Dinklage ended in disappointment or suspicion. Coco Chanel, the woman who dressed millions, never found anyone capable of dressing the emptiness inside her. The paradox was brutal. While thousands of women saw her as the symbol of female independence, she spent her nights alone in her Ritz suite, seated before the mirror, smoking endless cigarettes. Her pearls sparkled, but they were invisible chains. The woman who dictated how the 20th century should look never managed to design a refuge for herself. And yet, that same solitude became her fuel. Chanel turned pain into discipline, absence into determination. She needed no husband or children to build a legacy. Her surname, engraved in tweed and crystal, became a universal family. Perhaps that was her way of defying not only patriarchy, but also fate itself, proving that a woman could leave a mark without fitting into the mold of submissive wife or exemplary mother. But independence carried an emotional cost. Coco was known for her sharp character, her sarcasm, her cruelty. She rejected weakness, despised tears, and kept everyone at a distance. Friends, collaborators, models, all agreed that closeness with her was as magnetic as it was dangerous. Chanel could elevate someone to Olympus with a word, or destroy them with a single phrase. At her core, that hardness was a wall. The orphan from Abyssine never stopped fearing abandonment, and she protected herself by striking first. Her biography is marked by professional conquests, but also by an unfathomable personal void. The woman who gave the world a silhouette without chains carried within her the invisible chains of her own past. Her public image, however, continued to grow. Coco Chanel was photographed surrounded by flowers at her shows, with young models who seemed like substitute daughters. The press wrote about her as an untouchable queen, a living legend. Few imagined that behind the crown of pearls, the throne was made of fragile glass, held together by discipline and by a heart that never stopped feeling cold. The tragedy of Chanel was that, in liberating women everywhere, she never managed to liberate herself. Her dresses gave movement to generations, but her own life remained trapped in a circle of loss, mistrust, and loneliness. Thus, Coco Chanel embodied the free woman, but also the woman imprisoned by her own shadows. An icon who taught the world to walk with their head held high, while in her most silent nights she still searched and never found the lost girl inside a stone convent. The name of Coco Chanel was never confined to runways or boutiques. Her true power lay in planting a cultural seed that transformed how women saw themselves and how the world was forced to see them. Her legacy is not measured only in dresses or perfumes. It is measured in the silent revolution that turned fashion into a language of emancipation. Before Chanel, women's clothing was a prison, with corsets, enormous skirts, and excessive ornamentation. Women were decorative monuments who could barely breathe. After Chanel, clothing became a discreet weapon. Clean lines, comfortable fabrics, sober colors. A tweed suit was not just fabric, it was a manifesto declaring, "I am here. I take up space. I work. I decide. I exist without asking permission." This change was cultural because it gave the modern woman a uniform of freedom. In offices, cafes, and universities, the Chanel style became a symbol of silent authority. It was no longer about appearing fragile or docile, but about showing strength without the need to shout. Femininity, redefined by Coco, was not submission nor ornament. It was strategy, independence, identity. But Chanel's impact transcended fashion. In literature, cinema, and music, her name became a metaphor for elegance. Writers invoked her as a symbol of modernity. Actresses embodied her as an icon. Singers used her as shorthand for eternal luxury. Chanel became a word with its own power, capable of evoking an entire universe of style, mystery, and authority in a single gesture. Chanel No. 5 was central to this cultural legacy. It was not just a fragrance, it was a social amulet. To wear it was to belong to an invisible sisterhood of women bound by that scent. When Marilyn Monroe confessed, she slept in nothing but a few drops of No. 5. The perfume was elevated to myth, a shared fantasy embraced by millions. Chanel also reshaped the very idea of luxury. Once, luxury was defined by excess, more gold, more lace, more embellishment. Coco redefined it. For her, true luxury was restraint, perfection in essentials, permanence beyond fleeting trends. Her famous phrase, "Fashion fades, style remains," became a cultural commandment that continues to guide generations. Even in the politics of the female body, Chanel made a decisive impact. Stripping away the corset was an act of rebellion against centuries of oppression. Proving that a woman could wear a straight suit and still be sensual was a strike at the heart of patriarchal structures. Chanel showed that seduction was not about lace or ornament, but about confidence and attitude. That message still lives in every woman who chooses to dress for herself rather than for the judgment of others. And yet, her legacy is not without shadows. The revelations of her ties to the Nazi regime created a cultural paradox. How to reconcile the liberator of women with the woman suspected of having bargained with darkness. That tension continues to fuel debates, books, and films. In collective memory, Coco Chanel is both the angel who changed fashion and the shadow that will never fully fade. Perhaps that is the secret of her endurance. She is not a flat myth or an immaculate heroine. She is a contradictory, fascinating figure who forces reflection on power, ambition, and human fragility. Chanel did not only influence how women dressed, she influenced how the world thought about women's place in the 20th century and beyond. Today, more than half a century after her death, Chanel boutiques remain temples of modern luxury. But behind every storefront, behind every bottle of perfume, beats the story of a woman who forever changed culture. Coco Chanel transformed fashion into a language of freedom, and with it, inscribed her name into the social history of the world. Coco Chanel died in 1,971 inches her suite at the Hotel Ritz, alone, at the age of 87. Her end was as silent as her style. No fanfare, no public farewell, no family by her side. But the instant her heart stopped beating, the myth became immortal. The woman who had been born into poverty and abandonment was transformed into an eternal legend. Yet that legend carried a heavy weight: controversy. On one side stood the image of the goddess of fashion, the creator of the little black dress, of Chanel No. 5, of the tweed suits that gave power to women of the 20th century. For millions, Chanel was the architect of a style that never aged, the designer who liberated the female body from invisible chains. In the pages of magazines, on runways, and in museums, her name gleamed as a synonym for timeless elegance. But on the other side, there was the shadow of war. Declassified archives in later decades confirmed what had long been whispered. Coco Chanel collaborated with German intelligence under the codename Westminster. For some historians, she was a minor spy, driven more by personal interests than ideology. For others, she was a conscious accomplice of a regime that devastated Europe. The same woman who freed millions with her dresses had, at the same time, struck a bargain with darkness. This contrast turned Chanel into an uncomfortable figure. How do you celebrate someone who transformed the history of fashion while ignoring her alliances with the enemy? Can one separate the work from the creator, the light from the shadow? Every book, every documentary, every biography faces these questions, and the answers are never unanimous. The controversy did not diminish her posthumous rise. On the contrary, it intensified it. Chanel became an irresistible enigma. Her contradictions made her even more fascinating. Orphan and empress, liberator and suspect, myth and traitor. That duality is what keeps her alive in cultural memory. Had she been only a brilliant designer, Perhaps she would now be remembered like so many others. But because she was a figure marked by ambiguity, Coco Chanel became a legend. The House of Chanel, after her death, continued to feed that myth. In the 1,980 seconds, Karl Lagerfeld took the reins and transformed the brand into a global giant, reimagining the symbols created by Coco: pearls, tweed, the eternal black dress. In this way, the name Chanel survived its creator, expanding into an empire she herself might never have imagined. Yet each modern triumph of the Maison reawakens questions about its founder. Every time a bottle of perfume is sold, every time a Chanel show dazzles Paris, the paradox beats on. Eternal luxury built by a woman whose life was marked by controversy. Legend and scandal are inseparable. Coco Chanel was not only a style icon, she was a mirror reflecting the contradictions of the 20th century. Modernity and tradition, freedom and oppression, brilliance and shadow. Her legacy does not invite complacency, but reflection. And perhaps that is where her true strength lies. Chanel is not a clean, perfect myth, she is a human one. A woman who reinvented herself from poverty, who defied the rules, who conquered the world, and who, at the same time, bore guilt that can never be erased. Her story forces us to accept that even the greatest symbols of freedom can be forged from both light and darkness. Coco Chanel will forever remain a question without an answer. Was she an angel of fashion or a shadow in history? On the 10th of January 1971, Coco Chanel awoke in her suite at the Hotel Ritz, as she had done countless mornings over nearly 3 decades. The day before, she had spent hours reviewing sketches, giving orders to her assistants, still dreaming of new collections. At 87 years old, she knew no other way of living than working. Yet that morning, the routine broke. She lay down on her bed, sighed, and spoke her final words. "This is how one dies." Minutes later, the woman who had conquered the world with needle and thread slipped away in silence. Her death was not an ending, but a beginning. The name Chanel ceased to belong to flesh and blood and became pure myth. In the streets of Paris, in the shop windows of New York, on the red carpets of Hollywood, her legacy continued to pulse. Decades later, Karl Lagerfeld would revive the Maison with the same irreverence she had planted, proving that Coco's style had not expired, it had merely transformed. The message of Chanel, stitched into every black dress, sealed in every bottle of No. 5, tailored into every tweed jacket, remains unchanged. True elegance is not appearance, it is attitude. Fashion vaunt us, but style endured us. And beyond controversy, beyond the dark secrets of war, the undeniable truth is that no other designer achieved what she did, transforming fashion into a social revolution, a universal language of power and freedom. Coco Chanel died alone, yet her name has never echoed louder. She was orphan and lover, suspect and empress. She was angel and shadow, and perhaps there, in that irreconcilable mixture, lies her greatness, in showing us that even the brightest figures carry scars, and it is those scars that make them eternal. Today, every time a woman slips on a simple black dress, clasps a strand of pearls, or touches her skin with a drop of Chanel No. 5, she unknowingly repeats Gabrielle's lesson. Fashion is fleeting, but style, when born of rebellion and pain, never dies. Coco Chanel no longer walks among us, yet her shadow and her light continue to shape the path. Her story is not merely that of a designer. It is the story of a woman who became weapon, symbol, and eternal myth.